beware. You're in for a scare. Terror on the can.
I suppose my grandfather had eccentric tastes. The place he called home near the end of his life was a somewhat disturbing property that would surely freak out most people. It was a former insane asylum. Despite its off-putting past, he talked about it like it was the most luxurious mansion you could ever imagine. Instead of being creeped out by it, he was proud to own such a historic building. He bought it for a very good price, but spent quite a bit on restorations. When he passed away, I was stunned to discover that he had left the building to me. A few members of the family were a bit insulted that he had given it to me over them, but most were so unsettled by the place that they didn't mind. I guess I really was his favorite grandson. I drove up one day to take a look at the place, tour the building, and decide what I was going to do about the fact that it had recently come into my ownership. At first, I thought there's no way I'd ever actually move in. Arriving at the property, I was confronted with the sandstone monstrosity. The building was tall, towering over the landscape, with ornate windows and Gothic architecture. There was a circular water fountain in the front courtyard and a large clock tower at the entrance. Inside, there were several long and empty hallways. My grandfather had renovated the opening interior room into a living room and had rearranged things quite a bit. He had changed the doctors' and nurses' areas into lavish bedrooms. The kitchen was redesigned with expensive granite countertops. In one room, there was even a pool hall. He had turned the former grim asylum into his own personal manor. I'm not gonna lie, I was pretty impressed. At the time, I still lived in a cramped apartment, so this was certainly an upgrade as far as space was concerned. I was pretty hesitant, but eventually I decided to sell my apartment and move in. It might be a bit creepy, but it was much nicer than the place I'd been staying at, and there was no way I could pass up on all that space. It was free after all. It did take me some time to get used to it. It was so large that heating the whole place was nearly impossible. Whenever I walked through the hallways, they were always cold. Fortunately, I could heat the rooms with fireplaces and heaters, which made them feel warm and cozy. After a while, I stopped seeing it as an asylum and saw it more as a nice home that my loving grandfather had graciously given to me. I was thankful. The next part is a bit difficult to describe, but I guess it's relevant. I've had mental health issues off and on my whole life. They tend to get worse during periods of high stress. Shortly after my move, I started having issues at my job and with some of my relationships. I became very paranoid as a result. I was convinced that someone was poisoning my food, even when I was self-aware enough to know that it wasn't true. It still bothered me and kept me from eating for several days. I felt like I was having some sort of psychotic breakdown. Eventually, I sought psychiatric help, and after much assessment, I was diagnosed with schizophrenia. I didn't have any auditory or visual hallucinations, and with the aid of therapy and medication, I was able to keep my symptoms in check. The irony of living in a former insane asylum wasn't lost on me. Then, something strange happened. One night, I was heading to the kitchen to get a midnight snack. I had a blanket wrapped around me while traveling through the cold hallways. While making my way there, I heard the creaking sound of a door being opened further ahead of me. The hallway I was in had tall, heavy doors along either side. Each door led to a small room that the patients once stayed in. As I got closer to the sound, I saw a human figure walking out of one of the rooms. and I stopped dead in my tracks. The figure moved quickly across the hallway before disappearing into another room. Is someone in my house? Or did I just see a ghost? I asked myself. The mind is a weird thing. It can play tricks on you. I would know that more than most people. At first, I took what I was seeing at face value, but when I thought more about it, I wondered if it could be a result of my illness. I never had visual hallucinations before, and I'd been taking my medication, but maybe it wasn't working? Cautiously, I walked only a few steps forward before the figure appeared once again. It emerged from the doorway, walked to the center of the hallway, and turned to face me. Now, much to my horror, I could see a woman standing before me. She stared at me with cold, dead eyes. It made my stomach drop. She wore an old-fashioned white nurse's uniform, like something out of an old black and white photo. Her curly blonde hair framed her ghostly pale features. She stood there staring at me, almost analyzing me, for a few seconds. I was so intimidated that I couldn't look away from her transfixed gaze. The nurse started walking towards me as a wicked smile began to slowly spread across her face. In a panic, I ran back to my room and slammed the door. There was no way I was sleeping after that. I stayed awake all night watching my bedroom door. In the morning, I nervously peered out the door, but saw nothing. It took me hours to gain the courage to investigate the hallway, only to find that no one was there. After that horrible night, I started storing snacks in my room to avoid the empty hallways where I saw the nurse. I still wasn't sure what she was. Given the history of the building, I thought she might be a ghost, but with my recent mental health crisis, there's no way I could be sure. One morning, I was brushing my teeth in the bathroom mirror, trying not to think about what I had been going through. I suddenly got the uncomfortable feeling that I was being watched. In the mirror, I saw the haunting figure of the nurse gradually appear behind me. Shocked, I dropped my toothbrush and turned around to look. But she was gone. That's when I became convinced that what I was seeing was a spirit of some kind. But that conviction was hard to hold on to as time passed. I couldn't trust my mind to be giving me accurate information on what I was seeing. I just didn't know if I was having hallucinations, or if a ghost was truly haunting me. As the days went by, I started seeing her during the daytime more and more. Sometimes I would catch a glimpse of her out of the corner of my eye. Other times, I'd see her going in and out of the rooms, doing her rounds. I started closing all of the doors, hoping it might stop her from moving around at night. But by the next day, they'd be open again. The doors were being physically moved. I knew that it couldn't be a result of my mind. Then again, maybe I didn't close the doors, but just tricked myself into believing I did. Sometimes late at night, when I was getting ready for bed, I'd hear the sound of her shoes walking in the hallway outside my bedroom door. I'd shudder as she drew closer. If she was a spirit, then what could she want from me? After weeks of being plagued by her unnerving presence, I decided I need to see my doctor and tell him what I was experiencing. He thought it was plausible that I was having hallucinations, so he decided to increase the dosage of my medication in hopes it would help. It didn't. I continued to see the ghostly woman in the hallways and throughout my house as I tried to focus on my daily life. I'd see her again and again. She just wouldn't go away. Nothing would make her leave. I'd yell out to her in empty rooms, asking her what she wanted from me, or pleading with her to please stop and to just leave me alone. She either never listened, or I was screaming at nothing. Then one night, as I was drifting off to sleep, I heard a noise. It sounded like metal on metal, rhythmic. My eyes strained in the darkness as I looked around trying to see what was making the noise. I couldn't see well, so I flicked my bedside lamp on. The nurse was standing at the foot of my bed. She was looking down at me, as if I was a patient in her care. She was tapping some kind of medical instrument on my bed frame, but I couldn't tell what it was. Terrified, I screamed, threw the blankets off of me, and ran out of my room. I sprinted frantically through the maze of endless hallways until I reached the front door. I grabbed my car keys and bolted outside, not stopping until I reached my truck. No shoes, no shirt. I didn't care. I just wanted to get away from her and that damn asylum. I knew, without a doubt, this was not a mental issue. After I gathered my nerves, I came to a clear conclusion. I needed to research the property to see if there was any way to figure out what I was dealing with. The next day, my research began. I knew my grandfather had a binder of information he'd collected on the old asylum. He'd mentioned it to me before, and I just needed to find it. I spent the day digging through his storage unit, and luckily, I found it buried under a pile of cardboard boxes. The binder was full of newspaper clippings and documents about the place. They covered everything from the time it was being built to when it was closed down and sold. There were even letters and correspondence between staff within its pages. I learned about the grisly history of the asylum. All of the mistreatment and the suffering the patients had endured was cataloged as well. Reading through the binder, I came across horrific, detailed descriptions of treatments they would perform on patients in order to calm them down. Sometimes they'd put them in ice baths, other times electroshock therapy, but worst of all was the transorbital lobotomies. The procedure essentially resulted in permanent brain damage to the prefrontal cortex and left the patient as an empty shell of their former self. A steel ice pick was stabbed just below the eyelid, into the thin bone inside the eye socket. The end of the long silver ice pick would then be struck with a small metal hammer until the pick cut into the brain tissue. The pick was then moved around from side to side until it severed the frontal lobe's connection to the thalamus. Their personality, their self, and their ability to make rational decisions were forever destroyed. Here is where I saw a crude sketch of the tools used in the procedure, and I recognized one of them immediately. It was the same metal tool the nurse was tapping my bed with last night. The ice pick. I continued to flip through the pages to find information on the employees that had worked at the asylum. I soon learned that there was a nurse there who was legendary for the number of lobotomies she had given. Her name was Amelia, and if the letters are to be believed, she was not the nicest of people. I was horrified when I turned the page and was met with a photo of the very woman that had been haunting me. standing outside on the building's front steps with the other nurses, looking into her dark, hateful eyes. I was sure it was her. Every detail matched. The spirit I'd encountered was that cruel nurse who had worked at the asylum in the early part of the 20th century. Since I couldn't go back, and not wanting to be alone, I called a close friend of mine and asked if I could come over to his house. I explained some of what I was going through, to the extent that I could without seeming completely crazy. Being a true friend, he agreed that I could stay as long as I needed to, so I wouldn't be frightened. I arrived at his house, and we talked in the living room for a while. I showed him the binder and told him about what I had been experiencing. I'm not gonna lie, it was nice to have someone to talk to, and he made me feel much more comfortable. Getting out of that depressing asylum certainly put me in better spirits as well. Saying all of the story out loud to another person, I began to doubt myself a bit. It all sounded too unbelievable to be true. Suddenly, my friend asked me, do you hear that? I listened closely. We both then could hear the sound of a creaking door. It was coming from the hallway leading to my friend's bedroom. He got up to investigate, and I cautiously followed close behind him. Staring down the hallway, we both saw the ghostly figure of Amelia coming out of his bedroom. Please tell me you don't see her, I said. My friend, shocked and unable to form words, began to back up slowly towards his front door. I knew, at this point, he did see what I was seeing, and it was all very real. In her hands, she held a silver ice pick and a hammer. Nurse Amelia looked at me and smiled a foreboding smile. I knew then what her intentions were for me, and I knew that I wouldn't be rid of her. She knew about my mental condition, and she intended to use her tools to fix it the old-fashioned way.
Thank you for listening. For more stories, check out the rest of the channel. You know you want to.